Okay, why don't we get going? We've got some time here from 12 to 1:30. I know that if students need to leave early, do so, but given that we don't have too much time, it probably makes sense to get moving. I'm, just by way of introduction, I'm Edward Cunningham. I direct the China programs at the Ash Center and our Asia Energy and Sustainability Initiative as part of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia at Ash. And I want to just welcome everyone to today's conversation, from balancing to coalition building, the U.S., Taiwan, and Asia's grand reshuffling. One just important note, we will be recording the conversation, so that you should know that. That's largely just for putting it out so that people who cannot be present can hear what was said. The discussion is part of a 25-year Taiwan leadership program that we established under Joe Nye when he was our dean, and we thank the Boston TECO office as well as Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their support in this series. Our goal today is to explore how U.S. strategy in Asia is shifting away from an offshore balancing posture to perhaps something very different. And what this means for Taiwan, for the PRC, but also South Korea, Japan, and the evolving regional order in Asia. Joining us are Steve Yates, who is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and former deputy national security advisor, and our own Professor Tony Seish of HKS, whom most of you undoubtedly already know. We are particularly excited to bring Steve here to the what's often termed the other PRC, the People's Republic of Cambridge, as he was in many ways my first boss in life. So when I was an undergrad intern at the Heritage Foundation 3 decades ago, I began learning from Steve. And I think, at least I feel quite fortunate, but I think we're all quite fortunate to combine the views of my first boss with the views of my current boss, Tony Seish. Steve earned his degrees from the University of Maryland at SAIS and went on to serve in the National Security Agency, then as Deputy National Security Advisor for Vice President Dick Cheney in the Bush administration. He was elected chairman of the Idaho Republican Party twice. He's also a longtime consultant to the private sector. Tony, as most of you know, is the Daewoo Professor of International Affairs and director of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia here at HKS. So just by way of intro and to set the stage, over the last 2 decades, Asia's regional order has entered what some term a period of hegemonic transition without a governing framework. The institutional and strategic architecture that supported stability for much of the post-Cold War era is now under obvious and serious strain, and we are witnessing the emergence of a much more contested, less predictable Indo-Pacific. Many have written about aspects of this transition, providing some language to talk about it, but none of us can really know where it will lead. And I think that is what is so exciting and daunting about the times in which we live. For over 70 years, regional stability, I think, rested on 2 foundations. First, the U.S. provided what Aaron Friedberg called a kind of liberal hegemony at sea, an offshore balancing role that enabled maritime security without requiring deeply institutionalized NATO-like structures in Asia. Second, Asia's economic dynamism was embedded within the broader Bretton Woods system, a system that John Eikenberry argued depended on the U.S. provision of open markets, credible rules, global public goods, finance, trade. But both of those pillars, of course, today are in flux. I think on the security side, China's rapid military expansion, assertive behavior from the East China Sea to the Taiwan Straits to the South China Sea have pushed the old offshore balancing model for the United States to its limits. Structural realists such as John Mearsheimer and our own Steve Walt have long argued that China's rise would trigger hedging and balancing across the region, and that prediction is increasingly visible. Japan is undergoing what Dick Samuels at MIT described as its most significant shift in security identity since 1945. South Korea continues to navigate Victor Cha's classic dilemma of entrapment versus abandonment, balancing economic dependence on China with security dependence on the United States. And nations like the Philippines exhibit a volatile middle power pattern oscillating between autonomy and alignment in response to changing political leadership and specific issues and threat perceptions. And the list goes on. I think these dynamics align with Evelyn Goh's framing of Asian states as seeking to avoid dominance by any single great power by embedding themselves in multiple overlapping networks of cooperation. So that's on the security side. I think at the same time, the economic order that once reinforced its stability is itself fragmenting. Scholars such as our own Danny Roderick, Francis Fukuyama, point to domestic backlash against hyperglobalization. Others have shown how interdependence, once viewed as pacifying, is now routinely weaponized by states, choke points in supply chains, finance, technology. Our colleague Mark Wu at the law school identifies consistently deep systemic incompatibilities between China's party-state economic model and the rules of the WTO, which was not designed for a hybrid state capitalist power of China's scale. Barry Naughton, earlier Chalmers Johnson, highlighted how China's ambitious industrial policies, subsidies, techno-industrial targeting, state steering, challenge core assumptions of Bretton Woods. So against this backdrop, US policy has also changed. Beginning with this, what I would argue, the second Obama administration, through the first Trump administration, continuing through the Biden administration, and now into Trump 2.0, the US has moved away from traditional multilateral approaches towards a new era of geoeconomic statecraft marked by industrial policy, export controls, supply chain diversification, friendshoring. And the result is that we now inhabit what might be described not as a single economic order, but as a contested and partially decoupled one, with no consensus about what is going to replace Bretton Woods. So the strategic consequence is a region defined less by shared order than by competing and overlapping orders. I think the institutional landscape in Asia is increasingly complex, layered with sort of mini-lateral arrangements that exist alongside broader but now weakened multilateral bodies. More recently, Kurt Campbell, our colleague Jake Sullivan, articulated what they call a lattice work approach, for example, to US strategy. Flexible, issue-specific coalitions, not fixed institutional blocks. This transition places societies like Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea at the epicenter of strategic change and in a place of significant uncertainty, as behavior is harder to predict when it shifts, particularly when it's shifting on specific issues and actors rather than these institutions. I think Taiwan embodies what Bonnie Glaser has described as the trifecta of vulnerability: military, economic, diplomatic, yet it is simultaneously indispensable to global technology supply chains and the national security of neighbors. Japan is transitioning towards what Chris Hughes calls a normal statehood, with potential nuclear latency. It's expanding defense spending, a more forward-leaning security role. South Korea faces tensions between its economic integration with China and its security dependency, as I've mentioned, on the US. But taken together, these dynamics suggest that the US is navigating, I think, the end of two eras at once. The end of unchallenged maritime primacy in Asia and the end of the old economic integration model associated with Bretton Woods. So what will replace these systems? Not clear. What is clear is that the US is shifting from a posture of balancer towards something that our guest Steve Yates views, I think, as proactive coalition builder. Some mix of active coalition building, industrial strategy, regional deterrence. As one example, recent moves by Japan to deepen integrated command and control frameworks with the US, deepen energy and other cooperation with South Korea, reshape its security doctrine away from self-defense only toward broader deterrence and rapid response capabilities, I think all do provide evidence of some multilateral action, as I think Steve will discuss to some extent. I think by signing agreements like the reciprocal access agreement with the Philippines, Japan is arguably moving toward a coalition building model rather than relying solely on the US bilateral alliance. Others argue the opposite. They see the US as withdrawing military, economic, diplomatic resources in this critical region and asking Asians to take up the slack. Our collective moment, I think, of intellectual and strategic flux underscores the importance of today's discussion. And today we have the chance to better understand not only how Asia's order is changing, but how the US itself is changing in response. So just with that, I'd like to turn things over to Steve to share some of his thoughts. Then we'll turn to Tony for any reactions. And then I may ask a couple just preliminary questions to get us going, and then open it up to the floor to a broader discussion and to have you pose questions to any of us. So with that, my friend, over to you, Steve. Class number one.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
It's just whether I can technologically correct getting microphone to work. So success number one, it's a winning day. It's an honor to be here. I am very happy to be at Harvard's Kennedy School. These are words I never thought I would ever utter as a rural Maryland public undergraduate student. That one day, two very smart guys would invite an aging, balding, not that smart guy to come and talk to you about what's happening in a dynamic world. I'll begin with a couple of caveats. Number one, in my experience, Americans and our media and a lot of our analytical cohort overemphasize personalities. And I think that ends up being blinding to some of the realities of what's being done over what's being perceived. And one of the difficult challenges that anyone in leadership and national security decision-making has to face is the difference between perception and reality. And reality, we'd like to believe, is the science. It's settled. Well, it's not as easy as that sometimes, because we are all limited by what we are able to see and perceive. And we don't, in the words of the late Don Rumsfeld, know what we don't know. And we can oftentimes get elevated into very high visibility positions in academia, corporate world, government decision-making, and you lose that humility about the reality of we don't know what we're not seeing. And then if you're making decisions based on assumptions that are leaving out what I'm not seeing, well, what level of confidence should you have in those judgments? So I am here to give what the late Paul Harvey might say is the rest of the story, the way of speaking and thinking from what I see that maybe you do or you do not see, and to share some of the things that I believe that you may or may not believe. I have not come to this other PRC to bring you out as activist American conservatives, which I am unapologetically a member of that cohort, but I am here to share a way of thinking and perceiving these kinds of things that may round out what you are otherwise consuming. That begins first and foremost, remember personalities and blind spots. It's almost impossible to talk about the United States and the current world without people having an absolute nuclear level reaction to a personality. And if you have a nuclear negative reaction to the personality of Donald Trump, see, I don't even pay attention to his middle name, then you probably are not capable of believing that that person could be operating under a deeper logic to move systems in a direction for which there could be justification that you could agree or disagree with, but it's not just random craziness. There can be random crazy things said, but again, we're dealing with perceptions versus where are things moving. So beginning with some of the top level things that our leadership, regardless of who is in the White House, would have to face. I think that we have our first post-globalist president. And what I mean by globalism is that we made a bet somewhere along the way, and smarter people than I, maybe even here, will be able to give you better detail on that. But somewhere along the way, we made a bet that nations acting in concert, upholding global norms and global institutions, would forego some levels of autonomy and what was classical sovereignty in order to create this level of order that would be normative. It would help police, but it also would help people aspire and shape what their behaviors were with each other in a way that, especially after the calamity of World War II, might avoid World War III. And there are several institutions that fall under this broader basket of trying to set this superstructure that would limit what great and middle powers might do, but then enhance the chances of people growing into these norms and growing out of their problems. In a microcosm of that, we made a similar bet with the People's Republic of China in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, where it decidedly was not a wealthy, modern engine of growth for the global economy or even their own economy. We decided to have extremely permissive engagement priorities that expanded over time in many different areas on the bet that forms of engagement, openness, and integration would allow China and us bilaterally to grow out of the areas that were causes of concern or friction. And I think by the time we got around to the 2016 election campaign in the United States of America, and when both national conventions had signs in large numbers with the three letters TPP and a line through it, anyone with eyes could see something had changed. And it wasn't because of the people who were receiving those nominations. There were forces changing. And this was a response to what some of those forces were. We had time of the World Trade Organization operating, and was it in fact advancing world trade, and what were some of the consequences of that? As we move forward from that period, and understand, you have my sympathy in trying to understand what I'm trying to say, because each of these individual topics are worthy of a long conversation. So I will give wave tops of different pieces of this that I think give the context for how to understand the changing coalitions in Asia and Taiwan's particular situation in specific as we go. But this post-globalism is a very important part of the narrative. That post-globalism reality moved forward through the COVID pandemic and in some other instances where you, at this point, if you look at, say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you had the UN Security Council holding an emergency meeting where the invaded country is making an impassioned plea to the Security Council meeting that is chaired by the invader. And that institution absolutely, positively, 100% failed what its core purpose should have been. And the Ukraine gave up what we call the world's ultimate weapons in exchange for an international promise to protect its national sovereign boundaries. That global promise failed terribly. So we have some examples of that structure meeting with the challenges of reality of our world and falling below anyone's reasonable bar. I would think, you might have a different opinion. But if you look at how the COVID pandemic played out, you don't have to get trapped in the snare of were we right or wrong politically and what should we have done. Undeniably, the virus came from a place we all know. Undeniably, that government allowed for domestic travel to be limited while international travel was encouraged to leave. And the north of Italy was devastated because the textile industry that had been completely taken over by Chinese labor brought the COVID pandemic to North Italy like nowhere else on earth in the early stages. And then the government of the People's Republic of China proceeded not to give accurate and actionable information to the international community, but the Communist Party of China did what its core mission usually is, which is political warfare. And that led to tremendous death and economic destruction across the globe. But ultimately, what it really means, what I'm trying to talk about this layer of globalism, is that the World Health Organization failed world health. So we have the World Trade Organization, where the idea was we integrate China in and others, that they'll have this normative effect and we'll grow our way out of problems. In 2025, we have not grown out of the challenges in the structural economic issues or the competition among states. It is, I think, very, very difficult to make the case that in today's China, the challenge of intellectual property protection is easier than it was in the early 2000s when we had similar kinds of negotiations and debates. So we live in an era where globalism was tried, and in some key tests, it was found to be wanting. You could still make the case we still need these institutions, but I think if you believe any of what I have said, you can see where there might be a groundswell of people in meaningfully powerful positions that say, wait a minute, just as a business proposition, this model isn't working for me, isn't working for my constituents, isn't working for my country, and we're going to need to try something different. But what that different is still to be determined. So President Trump does some of the things that get outside of that global vision and first shocks the world with taking a different approach to trade. It's actually an old approach to trade, but it's different in that it's decidedly moving outside of that WTO consensus. What's the purpose of it? Well, to some people's thinking, it is an effort to rebalance the value for value exchange that should be at the heart of what makes for neighbors and friends and partnership and alliances, and what puts you in a position to be able to fairly and hopefully effectively compete. And so if you are animated by this as a first order, then you don't necessarily distinguish between competitors and allies. If you grew up in a time where you thought Godzilla was eating Manhattan, then you are just as tough on our allies in Japan in this negotiation as you are on our leading competitor in the world in China. But it's all about how do I get a more fair, more durable balance point in the structure of this economic relationship in the eyes of the person who's elected to make those decisions for a time. And so we have those trade negotiations going on. Clearly has an impact on what's happening in evolving East Asian interactions. When it comes to security, and a lot of the partners that we have in Asia, they aren't waiting for an American like me or anyone else to come and tell them what's happening in Asia. They live it. And if there is a question about what is the dominant non-status quo force in Asia, to be honest, there is no debate. There is only one country that has had expansionist territorial claims that have been acted upon verifiably over the last 10 years and longer. There's only one country that took unmanned islands and built out those islands and militarized those islands and expanded patrolling around those territorial claims. Only one. And there's only one country that has been going in and making decidedly unequal economic relationships that will involve some form of technology or industry or brand capture to the point for national champions to be able to enter that space. And there's also only one country that's operating at overcapacity with enormous potential to dump into markets and disrupt industries and disrupt labor markets. And that's happening not just in East Asia, but in Europe and other parts of the world. So I'm not pretending as if I'm unbiased. I'm not saying there isn't other parts of the story, but these are the parts of the story that it can explain why there might be more to the narrative than, if not globalism and the institutions of the past, then it must be isolationism and abandonment. There is a very active form of engagement going on right now. I have never in my life seen a national security team from top to bottom engaged in more of the world, in more conflict resolution and more renegotiation in under a year than in 2025. And I would challenge anyone to find any president, much less all of the others, negotiating significant peace agreements, investment agreements in the Europe theater, the Middle East theater, the Asian theater, all in under 12 months. And that's while dealing with significant restructuring and rebalancing within the United States. Again, regardless of whether you're for or against the motivations for the change, I think undisputably, this is very active and it is very engaged. We have had a very high number of leader visits from Asia to the White House. We've had the president go to the region. We've had most of the national security cabinet go to the region. I flew on the Doomsday plane for 9 glorious days on a terribly old aircraft, going from Japan to Southeast Asia. And the Secretary of War was deeply engaged in multiple counterpart meetings, multilateral meetings, attended the defense ministerial meeting of ASEAN, the dialogue partners of ASEAN, China, Russia, India, Korea and Japan, all present, minus Russia. All of the others had bilateral meetings and were in the multilaterals. This is the Secretary's second visit to the region in year 1, which is also somewhat rare. And so what we're in is not a period of isolationism or withdrawal. What we are in is a period that you are either understanding of or not understanding of, or in favor of or opposed to, pretty active engagement and rebalancing. And rebalancing to do what? In all of it, the logic that I see, that I don't think is frankly articulated by the administration as well as I would like, and maybe they have different thoughts than mine. They have not asked for me to be their spokesperson. But the logic that I see is that the old patterns of behavior were not sustainable for the United States. In key regions, the economic strategy interests and the national security interests of the United States and our allies were not in alignment. This was brought in stark display in Europe. We're now in the 4th year of the war in that region. And to this day, Germany still remains extremely dependent on energy from Russia. And so you have a situation where key allies are asking America to superinvest on the hardware and the diplomacy and the finances of the deterrence and defense equation, while the Europeans are seeking to have a foot in both shores in some instances of opportunity on the economic side, while concerned about the national security realities of the situation. And so that rebalancing is related to some of what is being attempted in East Asia. From my assessment, the alliances in East Asia are healthier in that respect than what we have been dealing with in some of the European theater. East Asian allies have invested at a higher percentage in their own defense by and large than some of the European counterparts. And the other trend that is also hard for us as Americans is to understand that we're not the only variable in an equation, and that there are decisions that are made by the leadership of China and the leadership of our allies that are shaping some of the realities that we are dealing with in this important theater. Oftentimes people will look at just the mass of the American economy and the immense power of the consumer market of the United States, and it's an undeniable reality that is number one with no near peer. Then China has scale and concentration of manufacturing. And that is very, very significant and almost no near peer. But if you look at the GDP of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, core parts of Southeast Asia, not to mention India as the other billion people of Asia that sometimes get lost in this equation, that is a substantial mass if it were ever to operate in concert for any particular purpose. And that has immense capability for balancing and mitigating competition among others and to helping provide for common security and common prosperity. And so just as we've had this debate with the Abraham Accords in the Middle East and balancing and revision of roles and missions with Europe leading the cause for taking care of neighbors in Europe, but America still present, still making a significant and decisive contribution, but not as the only or primary financier and not as the only and primary risk factor in a military sense. We are living through some efforts of that rebalancing in Asia. And it's not driven by a brilliant memo out of Washington, D.C. A lot of this is being driven by perceptions and realities among the players in the region. And I say that as someone who tried to write brilliant memos from time to time, who wants to believe that the American bully pulpit can shape things for good from time to time with all of our flaws. But the truth of the matter is, Japan has been on a normal nation project for the better part of 20 years. And differing leaders, but the one who is most associated with the idea is the late Shinzo Abe, and whether it was him as an individual or a correlation of powers around him, back to my caveat of overemphasizing personalities versus trends and forces, that Japan today is undeniably not the Japan of World War II. And no self-respecting intellect should engage in weird political warfare to suggest that it is. But if you look at the news today, that's exactly what the government in Beijing is asking you to remember. But Japan deserves to be treated like the responsible stakeholder that it is and has been for decades. And a Japan that is a normal nation that makes a meaningful contribution to peace and prosperity and collective security is a net value add to our alliance system, a net value add to other neighbors in Asia. And in fact, the most significant development in that regard to me has been after China began encroaching upon the Philippines. And I have to ask you, what kind of a country picks a fight with the Philippines? I tried for decades to get the United States to elevate our alliance with the Philippines, to get the Philippines to reciprocate. And it was one of the most frustrating interagency conversations we have in the United States government. Grand ideas and memos and proposals would go out. We'd meet with the Philippines, and an agreement would be made. And it was as if it went out into a gale force wind and went somewhere else, and we'd come back and have the same meeting a year or 5 years later and try again. And the alliance was almost as if it was a weather vane blowing in the wind. It was not moving in a particular direction. But I would argue that it has been the sobriety checkpoint of territorial encroachment, aggression in commercial and other military areas that has made the Philippines awaken for its own purposes, not because the U.S. asked or the U.S. demanded to invest a bit more and to engage the region. And Japan has bilaterally engaged in substantive ways in Coast Guard and other maritime security areas that were very good. Again, not because the United States said, you've got to do this because you are tributary states to our alliance system. They saw value of itself in the first island chain working together. And they also saw that the peaceful status quo in the Taiwan Strait was a vital national interest of their own. And so the cross-strait issue in 2025 is not viewed, in my assessment, in the mistaken framing of the normalization communiques and other documents. This is not just an issue of the Chinese people on two sides of the strait. I'll leave aside the fact that I lived in Taiwan for a number of years and have come and gone, and there are people who are not ethnically Chinese that live in Taiwan in a functioning democracy. But this also is the strategic waterways that 50% of the globe container traffic transits. It is a part of the tech ecosystem and manufacturing supply chain that is not just important, it is life-threateningly vital. And any meaningful disruption of that is not a political issue of do we like democracy and like our friends. There is real pain, real cost that a blockade or attack or significant disruption would impose on all of us. And so in my view, we have in 2025 a region that is in transition about what kind of balance there is in alliances. There is a question of where are we in our supply chains about vulnerabilities and how do we balance and manage the risk of those vulnerabilities. There is a debate about de-risking, perhaps decoupling. That's a whole other conversation. My own sense is we don't go to zero, but 100% dependent in areas that would be vital in a time of crisis is not sustainable. So how do we balance and transition and manage that risk going forward? That's more of the mission of some of these negotiations as I perceive it. And our private sectors are engaged in a competition to win the future, for which some of these old institutions are not defining or relevant. So if you're going to win the race for space, if you're going to win the race for AI, if you're going to win the race for kind of influence and coalition building going into this era that's not going to be defined by the United Nations and affiliated organizations, well then, what are the capabilities you're going to have? What are your energy supply chains? What do they look like? What is your mix of those kinds of technologies? How do you apply advances in technology to your national defenses, where your mission is not to conquer and take and hold other territory, but to make it hard for the revisionist powers to take and hold that territory? That doesn't necessarily require the same number of aircraft carrier battle groups. That doesn't necessarily require some of the other tools in our toolbox. The Bretton Woods framework was vital to our bet and investment in China that contributed to the much lauded and deserved rise out of poverty that occurred during the decades of the rapid growth. What tools need to exist since those institutions haven't done the similar purpose for the Western Hemisphere? And would a more economically vibrant and integrated Western Hemisphere supply chain make the United States a more secure, prosperous, and flexible and reliable partner to our allies in other parts of the world? These are some of the ideas and ways of thinking that I think are in play in what will come forward and what the administration gives by way of strategies and documents, what's in play in the diplomatic engagement, economic negotiations, the rebalancing efforts in these relationships, and what's driving the effort to revitalize some of these capabilities and supply chains in the United States. If we are less dependent, less vulnerable to leverage in a time of crisis, we are more capable of producing things for ourselves and to be able to sell or provide them to allies in need in times of crisis. And if we have a more resilient society, then we are a much more reliable ally and partner in these newly defined coalitions. I don't want to take all of the time in some of these openings, so I'll leave it to questions and answers to try to refine and fill gaps that I undoubtedly have left in shaping some of these ways of thinking about this era. But I'll conclude with where does that leave with brass tacks on Taiwan in the middle of this first island chain as a key investor in China's economic rise and had been integrated economically in very, very significant ways, but also kind of an orphan in the international community, engaged almost everywhere, but denied formal recognition almost everywhere. And what I think is the reality today is because of changed perceptions around China's periphery, and an acknowledgement that the cross-strait status quo is in the national interest of a lot of the neighbors and allies themselves, I think that there's a lower risk of Beijing acting and succeeding in a way that would change that status quo by coercion or force. Doesn't mean that this is not a risk, doesn't mean it won't happen, that a decision couldn't be made in Beijing to do that. But I think that the window where there might have been perceived a time of opportunity because of lack of American support for the material self-defense of allies, a lack of activism and being able to have more resilient supply chains and investing in winning the competition in key areas of technology, that some of this adjustment is reshaping some of that calculus about where we are. And I think that that might actually allow us to buy time and maybe find new ways to going back to an engagement with China where the objective is shared on both sides, that they are aspiring to what Bob Zellick called responsible stakeholdership, as opposed to being the dominant non-status quo power in Asia at the moment. And that's where I leave it.
Tony, you want to offer some thoughts and reactions, then we'll move to questions.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover.
My
in there.
apologies.
No. Yeah, I have a few quick thoughts. The first is I think what Steve does to start with is really important, not to overemphasize personalities. I think too much of our sort of writing and thinking has been, well, President Trump, is transactional, therefore, would he, in order to get a trade deal, give up certain security things? I don't think personally that President Trump had a very strong framework for foreign policy. I do think the key advisors around him do have a very clear idea of what they wanted, and most of those, if not all of them, are very strongly cautious and hawkish about China. Certainly the Heritage Foundation has had clear perceptions, and I think that has fed its way through into the policy process. So President Trump is mercurial, but there's bigger changes taking place, which I think sort of frame what are the possibilities for US action and how it will or will not move forward. And I think, secondly, I've only been able to read what was in the newspaper this morning from the latest National Security Review, but I think there are two or three things which are very telling in that. The first is, yes, of course, the US is focused on the immediate areas, Central America, Latin America. But I think what is very strong in it is also the support for the Indo-Pacific region. And the US really sees its commitment to the Indo-Pacific region as being strong and enduring, and that has consequences for the relationship with Japan, South Korea, and ultimately a position vis-a-vis Taiwan. And it is, of course, I come from Europe, I have to say, it's very disparaging of Europe. We are facing civilization erasure, for example. It does want to support many of the right-wing parties, the AfD in Germany, so on and so forth. I'm not a big fan of that part of it. Let me just leave it at that. But I think what is most important is it clearly shows continuing commitment of the importance of the Indo-Pacific, which I think has somehow got lost in these first few months of the administration. Steve would know far better than I, but my perception is in the first Trump administration, and even in the current administration, they have done more towards Taiwan than perhaps the Democratic administration did under President Biden in terms of contacts, following on from the initial phone call, of course, when President Trump was first elected, but ensuring a lot more flow, questions around the military areas, so on and so forth. So I just wanted to, emphasize that. So secondly, I think, yes, there are bigger trends taking place, and I think Steve has identified most of those. We can argue about values or not of the institutions which were built for the post-World War order. Clearly, the United States, in many ways, has said this is not working so strongly for America anymore. It needs to shift, it needs to change. One thing which I think is really important looking forward, and I heard a great phrase yesterday, that the Iron Curtain from when I grew up in the Soviet period is replaced by the tech curtain, the technological curtain. And I think that is very true. And I think it's very important in this context to think about that clearly the battle for the future is going to be over who controls the technologies of the future. And as I said before, you know, I love the era when a British three-pin plug ruled the waves everywhere our empire was. But now the fight is what are those technologies of the future? China's investing very heavily in that. It understands that geoeconomic, geopolitical power will come with that. And that tech curtain brings me back to what Steve was talking about, because in that process, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea are crucial elements. They have to form for the United States a crucial component for maintaining technological viability, trade, control in those areas. That brings me to the third point. Why would you protect Taiwan? It's a long way away. Who cares about it, you know? So I think there's three sets of arguments. And I think Steve highlighted the one that becomes probably most important in realpolitik. I think there's a moral argument, you know, given what Taiwan has been through, where it has come to as a democracy, the respects it has for its citizens, the engagement of the citizens. I don't think that's going to wash. I don't think people are going to go, you know, well, we have to sort of do some kind of action around Taiwan because of the moral argument. The strategic argument, I think people probably understand less, you know, the whole argument around the first island chain, but it's an important one. But I think, and Steve hit on this, the third one becomes a crucial one, the economic argument. That maintenance of the freedom of navigation through the straits and around the straits is crucial, not just for the US, but for China also, actually, and a whole range of countries in terms of economic progress. So I think those sets of arguments become important. I think what becomes particularly important is the economic argument in that framework. The last thing I just wanted to say was the Pew Research Survey this year has some very interesting sort of findings in it. And I wanted to ask Steve why he thinks this might be. You've presented a very lucid, coherent account for why the administration should behave in the way it does. Yet confidence in the US in this research is incredibly low. President Trump is actually rated along with Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping is not popular in it either. They're both at like 21, 22% confidence. Now, one might dismiss some of that and say, well, President Trump is an abrasive figure. He heaps out abuse often to people. But I think what I want to ask you is that drop in confidence more because of those big changes that are taking place. And therefore, countries in the region and those who are polled just don't know where the world is going. And so that uncertainty then transfers into say, well, we're not very confident in President Trump or in Xi Jinping, or they clearly don't want to see replacing as a major hegemon. Is that a fair answer?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and it would probably be impossible for me to presume to have the answer to. I have some theories about how you end up with poll results like that, and they come from my frame of reference. Again, I don't invite you to live in my world, but it's a beautiful place. You should want to live in my world, but you can live in your world. It's all fine. But in my world, I see outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post as having dominant information weight, not just in America in shaping narratives, but say, for instance, internationally, CNN International, it basically makes CNN's main station look like a bastion of conservatism. And so the information feed about America that is going out into the world, these are the main inputs that get translated by humans or AI at this point into the material that is informing international audiences about what to think about the leaders of America and what's happening in America. And so if I gave you a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week stream of what the Antifa riots in Chad looked like in Seattle for a sustained period of time, and then you asked people, what do you think is happening in America? They would say, well, holy moly, it looks like that is Somalia. And do I find America to be a reliable partner in it? Do I want more of that, or do I want to balance against that? Now that's an extreme analogy to draw, but just for effect. Add into that, we have the beautiful right for which I would shed blood, which is freedom of speech and competitive elections and leaders who go into august bodies like the United States Senate and Congress, and they're, for lack of a better logic, allowed to have their own opinion. And they go onto the airwaves, sometimes to be interviewed in other countries, sometimes to visit other countries. And they will go and say things like the fabric of American democracy is literally holding on by a thread, that they don't feel safe in their own country. And what is a foreign audience meant to take away? For here is someone who's a very senior United States senator coming and saying we have a very dire, borderline failed state happening in the United States of America. And what then am I supposed to be doing with regard to our alliance, our trade negotiations, dealings with alternatives? And so there's some ways that information gets shaped by our natural and beloved, but admittedly manipulative political system that doesn't translate well out into the world. And because of the vibrancy of that system and the somewhat combative relationship that every elected official will have with the press that's covering them, then we end up with having a difficult time giving clearly articulated strategies that have an inherent logic, and you end up playing self-defense through multiple news cycles each day. And that sort of raindrop by raindrop communication of strategy is not as effective as if you could take a pause and give a long ordered speech to do that. Now that's assuming that President Trump wanted to give that kind of a speech. But I'll tell you, I support President Trump in what he is trying to do. I don't have any reservations about having cast that vote, but you don't get to the point of electing a Donald Trump if everything else is working. And so to me, we don't have the kind of leader who's going to give you a speech that is worthy of foreign affairs, or going to a major university union engaging in classical debate. It's going to be the rough and tumble that is going to call you low energy and little and really ugly, and you're ripping us off, and we're going to get a better deal, and that's what the course correction looks like, and it doesn't travel as easily. I would also say that the two words "America First" are manipulated by critics of it that talk about it in the context that is deliberately unflattering, terrifying, racist, weird, creepy, none of which people part of that movement actually aspire to or associate with. But the idea of going back to seeking advantage for our country and our citizens and our industry and our future first as a core principle, and under the assumption that other countries will do the same in return, no harm or shame in that kind of interaction. That is more of the ethos, but those words do not translate very well in going out in coalition building or spinning the yarn that I was on some of the deeper logic of what is happening. And I think we're also in a period of our allies and partners having their own transitions and own awakenings with regard to dealing with President Trump in this second term, with what's happening in their own countries. I mean, what's happening in Japan is not driven by America. And some of what's happening in Taiwan is not driven by America. And what's happening in China is not driven by America. And there's some of these logics that are working their way up that we'll have to see where is the resting point in some of these trade and economic dealings. And when it comes to America's own experience with this, we had very distinguished people saying for sure we were heading into not just recession, but depression kind of economic risk because of the global tariffs that were put in place. And those are disruptive. No argument about that. But we are not at the precipice of a depression because of that. And so we're having the need to sort of settle into what are we really dealing with. We also, with regard to just the US-China relationship, which takes a lot of the oxygen in coverage and thought, we're in the early stages of what the president's negotiations with Xi Jinping may bear out. I might be sort of a cynical, skeptical, old rider on this roller coaster that doesn't expect big breakthroughs or changes coming anytime soon. But they could. We don't know yet where this is going. Candidly and personally, I'll tell you, my daughter was killed by fentanyl. This is a problem that was 10 years or more in the making. No one can make a credible argument to me or hundreds of thousands of other American families that the government of China did not know where this was being manufactured and where that money was being laundered. And to have Xi Jinping in 2025 say, I am now prepared to cooperate and shut down this flow in exchange for X, Y, or Z from the United States, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in negotiating away your murder of our people. But that's me. And my personal experience and anecdote can't govern what a nation state does. But we don't know yet whether the flow of those precursors are really stopping. Promises have been made, our leaders are saying there's a change, but until that carnage at historic proportions stops, then we aren't at a stable resting place. Some of those tariffs have to remain in place. And it does sort of say, what kind of a country are you? What kind of a negotiating counterpart are you if you are involved in the death of a huge percentage of the 18 to 35-year-old population of our country? And if the shoe were on the other foot, there would be a revolution brewing in China to do much, much more against us if we were the provider of that to them. So there's still a lot, and I veered from your question. I acted like a senator that I would criticize and talking too much. But ultimately, I think it's our information environment that explains why these polls and trends lag on this. And if what is being tried now is seen to work, those numbers will change. If it is not seen to have worked, then they will look prophetic and it will influence our next election cycle.
Let me ask one last question and then open it up. What would you say is the real goal of Taiwan policy for this administration? And how effective is the Taiwanese government in terms of engaging the US to maximize its national interests? So, and I ask that because it seems to me, and you touched on this, the US and China are buying time, clearly. Right? They're buying time. They're both diversifying away from each other as rapidly as they can. And that's varying rates of success to that. So one way you can look at this, I think that's where you're going, but it'd be good to hear. One way to look at this transition is to say, actually, it's a period of relative calm, actually, because most of the significant actions are really happening outside of the US-China relationship as the adjustment takes place, right? So is time on the side of Taiwan when it comes to its own national security, which would lead one to argue that, well, the PRC should act in the short term to blockade or bomb or, otherwise invade? Or is time on the side of the PRC, in which case buying time leads to incremental ratcheting, economic, military, diplomatic pressure, as we've seen in the past? How does that feed then into what you think the US goal is and how the Taiwanese are trying to shape us?
Well, ultimately, I'm probably guilty of being an idealistic missionary. And so I believe that time is on the side that opposes the use of force and coercion to take other people's territory. And so I don't think that time is on the side of Russia or China as the powers that are seeking to revise some of these.
Right, but then that wasn't that military towards thinking then that for Beijing, they do have to do something in the short term or not? Is that, do you not buy that?
So I long ago, I was a part of government circles that spent every waking hour combing over media, photographs, and it's what we would broadly call Kremlinology. Just because it was a closed information environment, we would try to deduce trends about who's up, who's down, whose influence is growing, and what's happening in a government based on who went to give some kind of a speech and what does that tell us about how decisions will be made. Over the years, I've become very, very jaded about anyone telling me that they know how Zhong Nanhai is going to make a decision. Or what is actually driving the mind of Xi Jinping. And I personally don't want to be in the mind of Xi Jinping. I follow more of a Stoic philosophy of emphasizing what I can control and leave the things that I cannot control to other forces. And I can't control what's in the mind of Xi Jinping. But I believe that if we do our parts right, that we, the United States, friends and allies in Taiwan, Japan, and elsewhere, and the forces for better prosperity and humanity in China are doing our part to make sure that advances in technology respect human dignity, that make sure that advances in technology and prosperity actually advance culture and civilization, ultimately are protective of the foundation of civilization, in my view, which is the family unit. So I want all government policy and whatever the growth and power of nations is invested in, I want it to be in healthy, thriving families as the foundations for communities, and then self-identified nations who would have a vested interest in engaging with one another in positive ways. That's very, very idealistic. That's very, very missionary-like. But to me, we have that possibility. And I think that when provoked by non-status quo threats, these kinds of societies rally in ways that are underestimated. We are seeing hopefully some of that in Europe. We've definitely seen it in parts of the Middle East that used to just be talked about as backwaters on human rights and other kinds of prosperity, not a Jeffersonian democratic paradise at this point, but moves more in the direction of humanity and balancing some of the revisionist and other trends. Asia is going to find its own way in that balance. I think America is there to invest, contribute, and be a reliable partner in that journey. But ultimately, that's where I am more optimistic about the endurance of the Taiwan model and of Taiwan itself. But ultimately, I'm more optimistic about it because it is not the sole purview of the United States of America, whether they sink or they swim. And the blessing and the curse, to your other part of the question, for the government of Taiwan is that they represent a vibrant, divided democracy. And that vibrant, divided democracy has to decide for itself, what does it seek and how is it going to communicate with the world, and what decisions are they going to make together to implement that, whatever the overlap in that Venn diagram is. The acid test of that today is that President Lai Ching-te has put forward a special budget that would make a great leap forward, to use a fun Chinese term, in investment in Taiwan's broader civil resiliency and defense capabilities. It is in response to, but not driven only by, what the US administration has advocated. It is mirroring some of what Japan is also doing, but the KMT is going to have to decide as a political party, is it more imperative for them to be the loyal opposition critiquing and obstructing the ruling party, or do they have some shared purpose that we had at differing times during the Cold War in the United States, where the Scoop Jackson Democrats would overlap with parts of the Republicans, and there was a coalition on national security in some ways that was meaningful. Maybe that will emerge in Japan, maybe that will emerge in Taiwan. It's not today. But as that emerges, that's the way organically democracies balance and preserve deterrence. And I think it complicates things for Beijing. I see the seeds of that in the soil and some of the sprouts peeking above the horizon. The question is, who's faster, the nurturers or the harvester?
That's a great image. All right, well, let me open it up and just state your name. So we'll start with you and then we'll move to Hal.
I'm Daniel Koss. I'm from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. Thank you very much for your talk, many insights. I have a question about your vision, Donald Trump has succeeded in shocking many of the allies in spending just a lot more money. And I come from Germany and I can see, I'm not sure it's going to be 5%, but it's definitely a lot more money spent. But I'm wondering, especially in East Asia, as Japan is also spending more on defense. There's talk about nuclear weapons, for example. Is there a point when perhaps the US doesn't like all that spending? Because, as you spend more on defense, you may not be following the US so much with what you do with the weapons. And so is there a point when you feel the US is also losing part of its control over what allies do, what priorities they set, where they intervene ultimately? I'm thinking of France intervening in Africa before. Maybe they had to ask the US about Libya. They didn't. And so I'm wondering about this, some sort of a dilemma for the US to ask for more.
Do you want to go questions or do you want to just answer that, Cyril?
I'll try to be brief, but it's a struggle. But I think this is a really interesting and legitimate area of conversation. In my view, stronger, more independently capable allies are an asset to the United States and are a frustration for the non-status quo powers. It is much easier for Moscow or Beijing to influence Washington, to lobby Washington, to negotiate with a sitting president and try to see where you could get, than to have to deal with a more atomized array of differing, competing interests and coalition of powers. And so a stronger, more independent Japan, I don't think that rational Americans would think increases our instance of a second Pearl Harbor. And a more stronger and independent Korea, I would say, in love and in fairness, I grew up in a big family where we didn't always agree, and we had the best arguments and longest arguments and all that other. With Korea, that is a constant minding and gardening effort with that alliance. Always has been, always will be. But a stronger and more independently capable Korea, I still see as an asset to the United States. And that can be replicated in other areas. Number one, it lowers the burden of the overspending we need to engage in order to project overwhelming power everywhere on a constant basis, and allows us the flexibility to surge where needed. And to be maybe the best outside balancer and support for the correlation of allies that share interest with us. And so I see that as a net positive and relatively low risk. Is it frustrating to those who want to write the elegant papers to say, this is our logic, this is our mission, and we want people to join with that? Well, maybe they're going to have their own way of talking about it. Maybe they will only participate in parts of this. But I think we're net better off in that because it's sustainable. I think it is a more mature way of treating the other countries. And it might be less desirable in a time of crisis when you want to just take control. But hopefully it avoids the time of crisis a little bit better by having this more organic and power dispersed decision-making, deterrence influencing engine that is humming along. But that's how I think about it. I think that is how some of the administration currently thinks about it. But the beauty and curse of our system is that in the next election cycle, someone with completely different ideas can come in and the gears will shift. But for now, in this time of transition, I don't have a concern of of the move in that direction. I also don't fear that more independently capable European countries are going to attack America or American interests in meaningful ways. And so to me, it is mostly upside with minimal downside, but admittedly more confusing and perhaps frustrating for people to understand.
And just one follow-up, so as a good SAIS grad student that you were, in terms of IR theory, right? So you don't really buy the idea that the move towards a more, so Dan's multipolar world will be inherently more unstable, or you do buy that argument. It's just, it'll be more unstable, but in a way that generally inures to the benefit of the US. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I'll be a good two-handed economist and say that there's both. Because I see these sort of distributed regional or other coalitions out there as a reality, but you will have powers that stand up above some of these from time to time, seeking to influence and move where the balance in those may go. And if America does things right for itself, it will have the ability to decisively nudge that in a direction with a coalition of people and a correlation of forces that can keep things moving net in the direction that we seek. And we don't seek it to own, occupy, and micromanage those other countries, but it's basically to be in our AI stack, to basically be in our standard setting and transparent, accountable financial system, to be in those kinds of ad hoc institutions. But I see it kind of both of those layers existing. And I like America's odds in being able to nudge where the balance might go in those areas, much better than trying to say it's American hegemony pushing subordinates to have to be a part of a defined ecosystem.
How?
Ultra Fellow with the Red Valley Foundation for Asia. So thanks for the talk. I think it's very insightful. So I have a question, like Tom mentioned the phrase like from iron curtain to tech curtain, and like semiconductors and AI are very important. So what do you think would be the best strategy for the US in the tech rivalry with China?
Well, my way of thinking about this, again, all of you are welcome to adopt my way of thinking, but I don't expect all of you will. My way of thinking about it is that I don't care what China does. I care what we do and what we do together with our partners. And if we do our part right, China will be put to the dustbin unless it adapts to our way of doing this, because I believe our way will work. We'll get to the moon first. We'll find ways to harvest rare earths in a way for which we will not be dependent on them at all, and they will increasingly be dependent on things that our network of people will be doing and needing to do. I think that our cultural and societal organizations around innovation, when nurtured and done the right way, will succeed. As China adapts to do more things like that, then coexistence and interaction naturally can follow. And it doesn't mean that it has to be a civilizational struggle where one wins and the other dies. But I think that we will lose and we will die if we obsessively look at, well, what are they doing? And we need to play on their terms. And only thinking about it as these two poles, when we have much more in this coalition than just ourselves. So I would love to see, so as a conservative that says nasty things about institutions and globalism, I would love to see a T7 instead of a G7 that is organized around technology rather than the old measures of the GDPs of certain economies, and having the leaders of the most trusted and accountable economies of scale on tech, setting standards that they hold each other accountable to, and managing what the norms are going to be for this brave new world of an AI managed education, manufacturing, and civilizational system. That can't be built on an information or political cultural foundation that ignores fundamentals of human dignity. And that unfortunately would be my assessment of where there is an original sin built into the DNA of AI that's coming out of today's China.
So we'll start, I'm gonna sweep back this way. You got Dennis.
Thank you. Dennis Kwok, former senior fellow at the Ash Center. Thank you for this excellent insight and program there with Tony. I've got a question to follow up on Taiwan. You mentioned about this defense bill that President Lai has put up. The KMT and the DPP have both vowed to block it. And you know how divisive domestic Taiwan politics is. Reminds me of my days in Hong Kong. And the CCP is very good at exploiting that division. And my opinion is that the collective will of the Taiwanese people deciding whether they want to fight back is really critical and is not often talked about. When people talk about Taiwan, they often talk about whether the United States will intervene. But in fact, in my humble opinion, the Taiwanese collective response is the most important factor in this equation. I want to get your insight on that. And do you think that collective response is there? Thank you.
So I would not deign to speak for the 23 million people in Taiwan. I love the fact that they can speak for themselves and they have a democratic system to elect representatives to speak on their behalf. I think that that representative system to speak on their behalf lags behind the reality of where the people are. I think that might be a structural issue in a lot of democracies. But there is an effort in Taiwan that is being driven by parts of the Lai administration. But I would argue if the KMT were in charge, they would need to be doing some of this too. And sometimes where you stand is a function of where you sit. And if you're in opposition, everything is wrong that the other side's doing. But there is this concept of broader civil resiliency. And that was, I think, particularly animated in the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That if you had Granny with a gun, then those door knockers from Moscow had to think twice about where different threats could be coming from. It's not perfect, and Taiwan is not adopting a bunch of grannies with guns. But it opens up a core principle of, are people willing to be resilient? And if so, with what tools and how, and are they practiced to do so? Because you can't rely on your first fire drill to be what your life depends upon. And so what I have been seeing is a lot of Taiwan society outside of the formal military demonstrating that they are more serious about responses to natural disasters that have a lot of the same roles and functions that would be there if in a military conflict where there's a question of resiliency on power grids and communication systems, hospital demands. What does your stored up blood supply look like? What do people know about the old Boy Scout merit badges that people need to be qualified in different areas? How are they distributed around where your population is distributed? And there is an effort for this whole society resiliency that is thriving in Taiwan right now. It started from an early base. It's not where it needs to finish, but that, in my estimation, should count in the percentage of GDP that is aimed at national defense, because I think it is a vital part of an ethos that gets at this question of not only are you willing, but are you prepared to weather a storm and come out the other side? So I believe that the answer is yes, but elected politicians are the last to reflect this. I would also just punctuate it with my own cultural observation, and because I observed it, it must be true. Taiwanese people are an incredibly pain in the backside lot to try to govern and control. The people of Taiwan were a colony of Japan for 50 years and came out the other end with their own identity. They lived under martial law for a quarter of a century, heavy-handed martial law. And they came out the other end with their own identity. And if there are any designs in Zhongnanhai to control the people of Taiwan, they ain't seen nothing yet. This is an absolutely ornery people that will be very difficult. And the scariest person in all of Taiwan society is grandma. And you do not want to be on the wrong side of a Taiwanese ama. And so they should not want to swallow this. I understand the attraction of the fantasy island of 23 million people whose per capita income dwarfs most of your own country. But my optimism is if attacked, they have a historical track record of enduring, sadly, and coming out the other side. But also, even among the youth, the device and social media addicted youth of today, they're participating in some of this civil resiliency effort that I find good and admirable, and I think helps in that deterrence equation.
Let's collect some. So G.
Hi, thank you very much for all your insights and solutions going forward. My question, I'm Gian Rebound, sorry, I am lecturer here. So it was just about a little over a year ago that South Korea witnessed and resisted political crisis turmoil. And so what I'm wondering is, to the extent that you see, so the question is really about the maturation of democracies in the region, and you pointed three that are the allies with the US as well as potential anchors in this coalition building effort going forward. So my question to you is, can you say a few more things about how you see the sort of the internal domestic, both polarization, and just their own recipe of democratic development, contributing or not in the stability of not only the region, but also just going forward this new balancing coalition building effort worldwide?
Well, so fundamentally, across East Asia, there are competitive democracies, and there are governments in power that have no guarantee of being in power when the next election comes. The margins are narrow. Same can be said of our system here in the United States, where we'll go through a midterm election, and I'm sure there's a bunch of august people who can tell you with confidence what the outcome will be. I don't believe any of them. And the same can happen in these changing of fortunes. President Yoon of South Korea was in a very good place until he was not. And the Japanese politics and Israeli politics are the two systems on this planet that I will confess a complete inability to understand. I watch them, I talk to people in them, I want to understand them, but that form of parliamentary coalition politics is too complicated for this rural Maryland educated American to understand. And so does that make for a reliable foundation for assumptions about alliances and coalitions? Well, I would say yes in the following sense. There are foundations in these countries and societies that are far stronger and more stable than the political manifestations would lead you to believe. And so commercially, economically, the leaders of industry that are driving growth and innovation in most of these countries, it's not because elected politicians are brilliant and have amazing guiding leadership to give. They're doing what they do in spite of whatever is happening in the political manifestations. And those foundations are strategically significant to the United States. Take one industry as an example, shipbuilding. The United States has to get out of its own way on shipbuilding and doing more for ourselves, but unless and until we do so, Korea is an amazingly capable partner in doing some of these things. And so if we're going to have a surge in civilian or military shipbuilding capability, regardless of what happens in the vicissitudes of South Korean politics, and we've talked among friends, I mean, I don't know why anyone rational runs for the presidency of South Korea. You have an almost 100% chance of going to jail or dying as a result of going into that office. And yet people still want it with their last breath. And despite that, you have some global shaping industries that matter to us and to our allies and to the world. And so it's that stability. We have to answer some challenging demographic and cultural questions. We've gone through a dance with, can we organize as societies where we're a bunch of atomized individuals, or do we actually have to pay attention to family formation and fertility rates as in the mix with migration, and what does it mean to have citizenship in our countries? But if you are going to have a declining supply of younger working age people in your society, can you sustain those industries, or is it all going to be robots that look human but aren't doing a lot of things? I mean, at some point we have to answer some of these political, social, cultural, sensitive issues, and that is going to play at least as much a role in success or failure as the coalition survival or transition in these countries. But ultimately, I would take the long bet on Japanese civilization and Korean civilization and the Taiwanese civilization that I see. Ultimately, I'd take the long view on Chinese civilization, coming out the other end of what I think is the CCP interregnum in the thousands of years of Chinese history. But that's another controversy that's worthy of another conversation or unwanted conversation.
Yes, right there in the middle.
Hold on. Thank you. Hi, I'm Niloufer. I'm an undergrad at the college. I'm an ROTC cadet. When we talk about defense of Taiwan, can you tell me what that looks like? First, what is conflict? Are you seeing blockade? Are you seeing fifth column activation? Are you seeing full-on amphibious assault? And then defense, is it going to be something like we did for Ukraine, where it's just enough for them to survive, not enough for them to win, restricting key capabilities like long-range missiles? And finally, victory. Is that an end with a deal that favors China? Is that preservation of infrastructure on the ground in Taiwan? Is that a declaration of independence? Just if you could paint a picture for me based on your opinion, that would be great.
So it's a fair question, and I will not give a fair answer. In part because if you put yourself at the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, you don't get the luxury of assuming that any one of those is the answer. You have to live with the reality that any of these things could happen. Any of these options may be necessary or desirable. And you're dealing with a mix of trial and error and other interactions that are going to force your hand in surging or not surging in some of these areas. So, do I think it is likely that China will mount an all-out assault to destroy Taiwan? I don't think that that is likely. But can I, if I'm the fake president of the United States, assume that can't and won't happen? You can't say never on that. So you have to organize your economic security, your deterrence posture, your coalition and alliance capabilities, and what you sell and provide Taiwan to be informed to address some proportion of managing that risk. I personally think that the coercive measures are what China is likely to use for a long period of time, with the hope that doing so puts pressure on the internal system in Taiwan to where a coalition emerges that wants to make a deal and sue for peace. And I think that's been at play openly for the better part of 20 years. Maybe even longer, arguably. I don't think the prospects of that happening in the next 5 to 10 years are very good. But you would have to also organize around, well, if that is possible, well, then maybe all this militancy is unhelpful, and we should, if the people of Taiwan are gonna choose some kind of union with China at some point, well, why would we want to make certain choices about our supply chains? Why would we want to get too forward-leaning, opposing what that union might look like? I would still put that as a very low probability, but I can't say it's zero. So you're balancing what you can do and with what tools. And that's where I would fall back onto the imperfect but real world option set of, I would like to do what I can to make sure that Taiwan is economically integrated with the rest of the world, but resilient enough on its own to be able to make its own decisions and to try to persuade its leadership that those decisions are consistent with what the managed risk approach America needs would require. And I would want them also to be very, very consistent with what the managed risk requirements are for their most important neighbor in Japan. And if that alignment is maximized, then I think we'll have the power necessary to extend deterrence, maybe buy time for China to make better and different decisions, and maybe we have better options that can be more decisive, where we don't get into is someone acquiring nuclear weapons, and do we need to threaten missile strikes and things like that. So a very unfair and non-responsive answer, but I think it has the added virtue of that is the reality of what a president has to deal with. So in my humble estimation, which of course has to be correct.
On that positive note, unfortunately, we're out of time. I think you'll have a few minutes after if anybody wants to ask questions and come up here. I just want to say, I think all of us can agree that we do not have enough of these types of civilized, intelligent discussions in the US today for lots of reasons. Domestic polarization, but also I think we do not have these conversations, particularly outside the United States, about US policy. So to me, I'm very personally grateful that Steve was willing to come. I'm also grateful to all of you for coming and having great questions. And I think hopefully we can do more of these productive, at least in my estimation, productive, civil, intelligent examinations of what the US is doing, but more importantly, what the rest of the world, particularly in Asia, is doing. So thank you for coming. Thank you to Steve. Thank you to Tony.
I would just like to share in closing, I have not often been slandered by being called civilized and intelligent.
I worked for you.
But I do want to share, especially with any students or young professionals that are in the audience, that Edward represents one of the things that I value most in professional life. And that is genuine cooperation among people who work together, where you can mentor and be a mentee, but at this point, he's arguably smarter and more influential than I am.
They know that's not.
But we have to make sure that we nurture that if we're going to have a successful civil society in our workforce too, whether it's academia, private sector, or what have you. Ultimately, we are human beings who need to be connecting with other human beings, and we need to be force multipliers and nurturers more than we are ruthless competitors who want to chop the opposition down at the knees. And our politics only nurtures the destroyers. That to win, you must vanquish the foe. But the work that we were able to do together at Heritage and then revived after 30 years because one person was better than the other and getting in touch is just proof that that kind of friendship and nurturing is very valuable and pays dividends in what you do. And so I hope that you will aspire to do that and you will seek it from the people around you. I would never have had my job in the White House, and you can blame these people for it. If my dean at SAIS had not had office hours and been willing to listen to my cheeky questions and be a mentor for me, so that when the Vice President of the United States was asking for someone to hire, I was at least one of 3 names recommended. I give him some grief that I wasn't the one name recommended, but that mentor relationship, super important, and thank you for remembering.
No, and so professors matter. We'll end with that. That's a strong message. So thanks everyone for coming, and Steve will take it.
Thank you for your words. Tolerating mine.
Yeah.
Inspired.
Everything's great. It's a great, maybe the year-round.
Oh my goodness.